Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're going back to the beginning, before the gods of Olympus, before humanity, before order itself. This is the story of the Titanomachy. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're here to unwind, to drift into sleep, or to simply listen to the oldest of stories. I'm glad you're here. Now, let's begin. There was no sun and no moon. There was no fire and no wind. There were no kings to build their tombs in gold, no mortals to tremble beneath temples of stone. Before there was anything, there was only chaos. And then, from the formless dark, came Gaia. She was not born, she was the birth. The vast and heavy body of earth took shape, ancient and alive, older than any language that could name her. Gaia spread beneath the emptiness, fertile and patient. And soon, from her, came Uranus, the sky, a great vault of glittering void that wrapped around her shoulders like a robe made of silence. She took him as consort, and together they were the first dominion, earth below, sky above. They were not kind parents. Gaia bore children to Uranus, 12 titans, mighty and radiant. Each of them a force of nature, their names heavy with meaning. Oceanus, Coeus, Crius, Hyperion, Iapetus, and Cronus. The sons, the daughters, Theia, Rhea, Themis, Mnemosyne, Phoebe, and Tethys. Their bloodlines would later shape the world. But Gaia bore others too, not beautiful and noble, but monstrous. Briareus, Cottus, and Gyges, the 100-handed ones. The Cyclopes, with their single searing eyes and brute strength. These children were different, and Uranus, afraid of their power and form, judged them unworthy. He forced them back into Gaia's womb, deep in her bowels, hidden beneath stone and silence. Gaia cried out, not in words, but in mountains rising and forests twisting. Pain turned to rage, and from rage came a plot. In the black of the world before memory, she shaped a sickle out of the bones of the earth, cold and shining with ancient power. She offered it to her children, calling for rebellion. Only one stepped forward. Cronus, youngest of the Titans, cunning, beautiful, terrible. He waited, silent in the night, hidden behind the stones of the world. When Uranus descended to lie with Gaia, Cronus struck. The sickle sang as it tore through flesh not meant to bleed. The sky god screamed, his cry shaking the stars into being. His blood fell into the sea, and from the foam, strange beings stirred. The Furies, the giants, the ash tree nymphs, and a new goddess, Aphrodite, born of blood and wave. Uranus fled, broken and eternal, his body becoming the sky itself, stretched forever across the heavens. But before he vanished, he cursed his son. He foretold that Cronus, too, would fall by the hand of his own child. It began as a whisper, and in time it would become thunder. Cronus took the throne. He crowned himself king of the cosmos, ruler of all things that had form and name. He married his sister, Rhea, and ushered in what mortals would later call the Golden Age. But the crown was heavy with prophecy. He remembered the curse, and in fear, he turned on his children, swallowing them whole as they drew their first breath. Yet fate is never silenced. One child escaped, spirited away to a cave on the wild mountainside, raised among beasts and shadows, taught by old gods and whispering earth. A child who would one day rise, not as a sun, but as a storm. Zeus. And so, the world creaked toward war. Not a mortal war, but a war of gods, a war of unmaking, of prisons made from time itself, of monsters born from hate, of titans who once ruled, and titans who would fall. Before there was Olympus, there was Othrys. Before the gods wore crowns, they wore chains. Before there was peace, there was the Titanomachy. The world was still young, though time had no name, and memory had not yet learned to record its own weight. The stars were scattered across the void, like bone fragments flung by a dying god, and the earth lay beneath them, swollen with potential and seething with unspeakable shapes. Gaia was the first form to rise, with will and with womb. Her flesh was rock, her breath, the wind that would become seasons, her body the very soil that would one day remember every footstep ever taken by man or monster. She lay alone for a time, warm and immense, until she grew lonely in her silence and birthed the sky to be her mate. Uranus came forth as a canopy of living firmament, a dome of glistening power that stretched above her and enclosed the first vault of existence. He was not gentle, he was not kind. Uranus was brilliant and eternal and utterly afraid. He had been born second, and though he towered above Gaia, wrapped around her like a cold shroud, he knew his power came from her. In that first age, power was not measured in kingdoms or weapons. It was measured in the number of children one could shape from chaos and stone. Gaia began to birth. She labored not in pain, but in purpose. From her came the 12 Titans, tall and terrible, each echoing some elemental law of existence. They stood as siblings and mirrors, beautiful and brutal. There was Oceanus, whose veins coursed with salt water, and Hyperion, whose eyes burned like suns. Coeus and Crius, contemplative and quiet, but vast as mountains. Mnemosyne, who remembered every breath ever taken. Themis, who whispered of laws before laws. And there was Cronus, the youngest, the sharpest, the one who watched when others spoke. But Gaia did not stop with the Titans. She reached deeper into the well of her own strangeness and brought forth the Cyclopes, 3 suns with one blazing eye each and arms thick as columns. They were Arges, Brontes, and Steropes, and their roars could shake valleys. Then, deeper still, she birthed the Hecatoncheires, monstrous beings of such frightful form that even words rebelled against their description. They had 50 heads each and 100 hands, their limbs tangled like forests torn by storm. Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges. They were not children shaped in gentleness. They were born from the raw violence of the world, necessary and mad. Uranus looked upon these new children, and for the first time, the sky recoiled. He was appalled, not by their strength, but by their reminder that Gaia could shape things beyond his control. In that, he sensed rebellion, even if it had not yet formed. So, with a wrath that cloaked itself as divine judgment, he forced them back into Gaia. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. He thrust them into her deepest caverns, trapping them within her very body, like seeds buried under endless stone, screaming without sound. Gaia, the All-Mother, became a prison, her belly a tomb, and with every heartbeat, she felt her children clawing from within. This was the first cruelty, not the act of war, but the betrayal of love. Gaia had created Uranus to be her equal, her sky-bound mirror, but he had become her tyrant. She lay in pain, her skin cracking into fault lines, her mountains weeping with molten fury. But Gaia was not a thing that surrendered. She knew that time could be bent. That prophecy was not some feathered dream, but a weapon waiting for a hand. She began to plot. Gaia gathered the Titans in secret, speaking not in words but through tremors in the earth, through strange winds that blew only in shadowed valleys. She showed them her pain. She spoke of the brothers buried alive, of the screaming that echoed in her stones. She asked for retribution. One by one, the Titans turned away. Oceanus looked to the sea. Hyperion studied the stars. Coeus claimed the wisdom of silence. Only one did not turn. Cronus, the youngest, the one who had not yet built a throne, but dreamed of one. Cronus listened. He had always been the one who noticed the tremble in a voice, the hesitation in a footstep. He was not the strongest. He was not the kindest. But he was the most dangerous. Gaia trusted him with the task. From her ancient bones, she pulled forth a sickle. Not a farmer's tool, but a weapon of old matter, forged in the fireless forges of the deep earth. Its blade curved like a crescent moon, sharp enough to divide the sky. Cronus took it. There was no thunder on that night, no celestial omen. Only the slow folding of evening, the rustle of leaves that had never known fear. Uranus descended to Gaia, as he always did, stretching across her vastness, wrapping her in sky. And as he did, Cronus emerged from the rock. He moved with the silence of centuries. The blade flashed, and the sky screamed. The sound was not heard so much as felt. It shattered the calm of the stars. Uranus roared, not in pain alone, but in disbelief, that his son would rise against him, that power could be torn from flesh. Cronus did not hesitate. He struck, and struck again. The sickle sliced through Uranus, severing him. From the wound, blood poured like wildfire across the world. Drops fell into the sea, hissing, burning, frothing, and from that divine blood, life twisted into form. The Furies rose first, screaming mothers of vengeance. They carried justice in their bones, blood on their breath. Then the giants came, terrible and proud. Then the Meliae, ash tree spirits who whispered to later men. And from the foam where the blood thickened into wave, another came Aphrodite, luminous and strange, born not from womb, but from violence. Uranus fell back into the sky, broken but eternal. He did not die. He became the night above. But before he vanished into cold silence, he cursed Cronus. He spoke a single truth, that Cronus, like him, would fall by the hand of his child. The wound bled prophecy. Cronus did not flinch. He cleaned the sickle and cast the remains of his father into the winds. He declared himself the king of the cosmos, lord of time, master of the heavens. The other Titans bowed. Rhea took his side as queen. The world shifted again, and the age of Titans began. But the blood had not dried. The sea still whispered of betrayal. Gaia stood tall once more, but her silence was heavy. Deep inside her, the hecatoncheires still stirred. The Cyclopes pounded their fists against the walls of their living tomb. And the sky, though wounded, watched, always watched. Cronus washed the sickle in the surf until the sea ran clear and quiet, then buried the blade beneath a newborn cliff, as if the earth itself could be made to forget. He set his throne upon Mount Othrys, a jagged spine of stone that looked across plains and river and the distant shadow of other mountains where a younger pantheon would one day raise halls of gleaming marble. The air around him thickened into dominion. The other titans gathered and bent the knee, not from love but from recognition. Power clings to a victor the way storm smoke clings to a valley, and for a while the world believed that it might be tamed. Gaia remained vast beneath them, her rifts sutured for the moment, her voice slow and cool as a river in winter. Uranus receded to the far vault, a wounded sky that still watched. The age that followed would be remembered by mortals as golden, and they would sing of it as if it were soft and simple. They would not see the knife hidden under the cloak. Cronus began with order. He parceled out the first courts and councils as a king who understands that loyalty is fed upon responsibility as much as it is upon fear. Oceanus received the encircling waters and moved along the rim of the world like a crown of rivers. His daughters, the Oceanids, who would someday marry gods and pour their names into valleys and cities. Tethys became nurse to the streams, a quiet queen whose work was never done, who cradled the sources of every river and the clear eyes of every spring. Hyperion took the proud vault of light, and Thea the brilliance that makes jewels speak. From them would come Helios and Selene and Eos, steady sun and patient moon, and the breathless herald who opens the gates of morning. Chios and Phoebe became keepers of the poles of thought, the slow turning of knowledge, and the silver face of prophecy. Their daughters would be Asteria of falling stars, and Leto of the islands where bows would one day sing. Crius stood out on the far-measured marches where the winds breed and name themselves. Iapetus, hard and iron-minded, gathered to him the impulse men later called boldness and ruin, and in time his sons would carry that mixture into the stories of mortals, Atlas bearing the roof of the world, Menoetius burned by his pride, Epimetheus slow to learn, and Prometheus the thief of fire. Mnemosyne kept the vault of remembrance itself, every event and every tone, a river that does not forget. Themis stood beside law like a carved column, not as mere judge, but as the breath that makes justice possible. These were not titles alone. They were living jurisdictions that pressed their shapes into mountains and clouds and tides. Beneath all that apportioning of the cosmos, Cronus heard the whisper that had stained the night when he cut his father down. A child will overthrow you. He kept that sentence folded and hidden behind his eyes, and the knowledge moved in him like a shard. Cruelty, when it is born of fear, learns to smile. He summoned song and games to Othrys, and the halls were grand. Columns of basalt and white stone seamed with metals that had no names. Titans feasted, and stories bloomed along the walls in living pigments. Mortals, in the time when they arrived, would later tell each other that there were no winters in those days, and that men did not grow old or ache, that the earth gave grain without tillage, and the orchards bent down to place fruit in open hands. They would remember a festival in Athens where slaves ate with masters and taboo was lifted, and the city pretended to be equal and unafraid, and they would call that day the Chronia, in honor of a memory both bright and crooked. It is easy to praise a season when you are far away from it. Those who lived under Cronus knew there was peace, and they also knew whose hand held the blade that kept it. The first weight of the rain fell upon the brothers who had been forced into Gaia. The Cyclopes and the 100-handed ones pounded within the earth, and the sound was felt in the souls of every being that could stand. Gaia spoke to her new crowned son. "Free them," she said in the language that is earthquakes and the shiver of tall pines. Cronus refused. He had heard his father's prophecy and understood its shape. True danger does not always wear a beautiful face. The Cyclopes had one burning eye, each that saw through the top of their skulls, and they had the knowledge of forges that had not yet been lit. The 100-handed ones were a storm-given body. No king who plans to keep his throne would release such power into the world unless he held something stronger in reserve. So he left them in darkness and placed heavier chains upon their stone prisons, chains that echoed into the edges of Tartarus, where the light of the world does not reach. Gaia's patience grew thinner, and in her deep places, a second plan began to root. Cronus took Rhea for his queen, and she, unlike the others, could stand at his side without bowing her head. She was cool-faced and implacable, a mother of the gentlest turns of the seasons and the sharpest rhythms of the womb. For a time, their union matched the promise of the age. Crops rose. Winds blew from the clean quarters. The world's waters knew their paths. The first child came, and the court gathered to watch. Her name was Hestia, hearthlight and the sanctity of home, the quiet order at the center of things. Cronus held her, and for a moment his face opened and his hands trembled. Then the prophecy returned. "The child will overthrow you." He swallowed her. He did not bite. He did not tear. He simply opened his mouth and placed the newborn goddess inside, and let the machinery of his immortal frame hide her away in a living vault. The court went still. Rhea did not cry out. She stood as if winter had entered her bones and would never leave. The next birth came and the next, and each time the court repeated the same ritual of awe and stifled fear. Demeter, who would one day teach humankind the plow and the sacred timing of the seed. Hera, stately as an oak tree in a windless field, with the gaze of a queen who can forgive or punish as easily as drawing breath. Hades, grave and unsmiling, whose presence made the torches falter, and Poseidon, fierce and unpredictable as the deep places of the sea. Each of them held for a moment in arms that were once a brother's, and each of them sent down into the dark chamber of their father's body. Rhea watched her children vanish, and in the watching she learned a new kind of endurance. The court learned to praise at banquets and go silent when the queen walked the long outer galleries alone. Gaia stood beneath the mountains and waited for Rhea to find her. There are reasons mortals later confused the name of Cronus with the cold word that measures duration. It is not because he was time itself. It is because his reign taught the world that a rule can be both fruitful and devouring, that hours can fill with bread and music, while their center is a locked door. Themis spoke to him in council and was heard for a while, telling him that a kingdom does not remain with a man who feeds upon his own future. Mnemosyne did what memory always does. She kept the record. Oceanus moved along his rim and kept the boundary sure. Hyperion's light washed every stone, and still the prisons in the belly of the world and the belly of its king remained filled with the children of tomorrow. A palace can be crowded and still be empty. Those who came to Othrys loved their king for the peace and feared him for the cost of it. Rhea went to Gaia at last. She crossed silent forests and stood in the umbra of cliffs where vultures rarely came and where the smell of resin from the pines was strong as incense. Gaia rose as a mountain rises, speaking through its roots. She did not promise victory. She promised a path. The sisters of Rhea came to her in secret afterward. Themis placed a firm hand upon her wrist. Mnemosyne carried to her a handful of names. Phoebe gave her a quiet map of the night. They did not speak of rebellion in the open courts, because a prophecy makes every corridor into a listening ear. Rhea returned to Othrys with her eyes clear and her breath steady. She slept beside Cronus and felt the machine of his fear hum through his ribs. Another child stirred in her, and with him stirred the entire architecture of the future. As the months turned without true months to mark them, Rhea prepared the smallest of revolutions. To one pair of attendants, she gave the task of packing and repacking the trunks of jewels that queens always move from place to place. To another, she entrusted the care of a small goat that had wandered up from some high pasture, with horns like crescents and eyes bright as wet amber. To a third, she gave a bundle of swaddling cloths and a strange stone from Gaia's hand that had a weight heavier than its size deserved. Cronus smiled more often during this time than any who had watched him could remember. He still swallowed the truth that lived in his stomach, but he did not suffer dreams. Men and women will tell you that guilt brings nightmares. Kings learn that they sleep better once they accept what they are. On the day Rhea felt the hour press upon her, she asked for the rites to be performed in a country chamber far from the main halls. The palace of Othrys had many such rooms. The midwives came, and the musicians were called to play songs that eased breath and pain. This is how it is told, and in the telling one senses the quiet choreography of a plan that must succeed on its first step, or not at all. When the cries of the queen reached the pitch that summons kings to doorways, Cronus came with his face arranged into concern. He had grown more graceful at the role of father over the years because he had pushed the meaning of that word out of his mind. Rhea held a wrapped bundle and did not hold his gaze. A heartbeat later he had taken it and opened his mouth and swallowed as he had swallowed the others. The court exhaled and lowered their shoulders. The music found a new key. Cronus thanked the attendants and kissed the brow of his wife the way a king kisses every symbol that assures him of his safety. The bundle he swallowed was stone. In the chamber where Rhea had truly delivered, a child lay and breathed with the calm of someone born to air that already knew his name. He had a face that would later become an emblem carved upon coins and lintels, the line of the brow like a ridge of chalk, the eyes grey as an oncoming storm. The goat nuzzled close, and milk stained the corners of his mouth. The attendants swaddled him in cloths that smelled faintly of cedar resin. Outside, the court made their salutes to a false act. Inside, a queen and a mother and a daughter of the earth began the reshaping of an age. Rhea left Othrys that night with a caravan that did not look like a caravan. She went as a woman who wishes to sleep beneath a different sky for a while, and to hunt with new hounds, and to see if a certain valley had the right kind of flowers for the garlands that cool the head. With her went chests and blankets, and a cradle that never saw the halls of the palace again. She crossed to a land where high mountains fold into one another like the backs of sleeping beasts. Crete rose before her, dark and welcoming. There were caves there that had known sacred fires before fires were called sacred. Some told of the place near Lyctus. Some swore the cave was on Mount Ida. Others said Mount Dicte. The names changed with the singers. The truth was always the same. There was a cave. It had been waiting for this child. In that cave, the nymphs Adrastea and Ida learned the rhythm of a new duty. They carried the infant to their breasts. They sang old songs that had been forgotten since the first winter. They named the goat Amalthea and bound her with a ribbon that had once hung from the girdle of a goddess. The Curetes came down from their ridges wearing bronze and carrying shields broad as doorways. They danced their warrior dance and clashed metal upon metal to drown the cry of a god, so that no ear on Othrys would hear it. not mortal, not Titan. A young oak grew at the mouth of the cave, and the wind in its leaves told stories of the day when this child would carry a weapon that sounded like summer storms tearing the bark from trees. Rhea stood at the threshold as dawn returned for the first time as more than a passing light and swore a promise without speaking. She left the cave with a heart that beat in two places at once. Cronus slept well in those days. He dreamed of nothing. He did not notice that the music at court seemed thinner or that the scent of pine resin hung in the palace as if a forest had exhaled in grief. He did not ask why a certain chest that had been moved to a particular room was never opened. He sat upon the black throne of Othries and accepted tribute from rivers and stars. He called councils where Themis spoke, and he approved her words when they suited him. He allowed Mnemosyne to keep her records. He praised the rising of certain constellations because Hyperion's voice made him believe he cared about their exact position. He walked with Rhea in public galleries and with other queens in galleries that had been designed for secrecy. He was a king. And kings often forget that the first duty of a ruler is to look, truly look, at the eyes of those who share their table. Gaia did not forget. In the deep places, she stored her anger the way a smith stores metal bars for a later craft. She had expected more from the sun who cut down the cruel sky. And when that sun proved to be only a different weather of the same storm, she began to dream of another hand to hold the world. The Cyclopes and the 100-handed ones slept poorly in their chains and learned the names of patience and calculation. The rivers ran the same paths every day. The sun and moon followed their appointed gates, but beneath the pattern that mortals later called golden, the earth gathered its quiet forces. A rain can last a lifetime, or 3, or 1,000. In the mind of a goddess, a rain is only the way a throat clears before a song. On the day Cronus held court to celebrate another circuit of the heavens that he believed he anchored, a servant stumbled as he entered with a tray of fruits, and the silver bowl rang upon the stone. The sound echoed just enough to catch the king's ear. For a breath, he looked down into the deep black floor and saw not the reflection of his own face, but a grey flash like the belly of a storm cloud when the first spark tastes the air. He told himself he had seen nothing. He smiled, and the courtiers smiled back. He raised a cup, and all the nobles lifted theirs. He drank without tasting. The gods have their omens, and sometimes they do not know them. Far from Othris, a child reached for the goat's warm flank in his sleep. The cave held him the way a cradle holds the sea in a shell. The nymphs stacked cheeses in cool alcoves, and the curetes rehearsed their clamor until the mountain rock learned to keep secrets. Rhea watched the doorway from a shadowed niche and listened to the world breathe. She could feel the line she had drawn now, a line that ran from the sickle in the surf to the stone in a king's gut, to the small ribs lifting and falling in the palms of her hands. There was fear in her. There was also something else, something older than fear. The word has been translated as resolve, as faith, as destiny. None of those are precise. It was the feeling a mother knows when she understands that the future already belongs to the child she carries on her hip. The cave smelled of wet stone and goat milk, and a sweetness like crushed laurel, and into that mixture the child breathed and became real. He slept with one fist tucked under his cheek, while the rain spoke at the mouth of the cavern, and the bronze shouts of the curetes hammered the air into a shield. There is a rhythm that the body learns from the place it first sleeps. Zeus took into himself the slow drip of the stalactites, the heartbeat of the mountain, the rumble that comes when the earth turns and grinds its teeth. Adrastea and Ida lifted him, each in turn, and felt the odd weight of him, a weight that had nothing to do with flesh. They sang the thread of an old lullaby that bent toward prophecy without naming it. Amalthea leaned in, and he found her by scent more than sight, and pressed his mouth to the warm fur and the generous teat. He was not the first child to take that milk, but he was the first for whom the act would become a story told beside cooking fires 10,000 years later. Rhea visited the cave as the seasons rolled over themselves. She came with the patience of a stone and the tremble of a mother. She brought blankets woven with the constellations that Hyperion had once named, and she folded them around her son and whispered to him the history of his own blood. Adrastea taught him to listen for the difference between the footsteps of a friend and the footsteps of a hunter. Ida showed him how to climb without breaking the brittle crust of rock that seals old air from new. The Curetes clashed their shields whenever he cried, and clashed them again whenever a man from Othrys passed too near and had questions that might ruin everything. The goat gave more than milk. One day she caught her horn on a branch, and it broke in a clean arc that shone like a small moon. The nymphs cursed softly, and then saw the gift as the child did. He lifted the horn, and the cave seemed to fill with figs and dates and bread and bowls of honey. They laughed and named it the Horn of Plenty, and that name passed into a language not yet born. There were others who found their way to the cave with stories and lessons wrapped in cloaks of secrecy. An old man came from the sea with eyes like shells and hands thick with salt lines. He carried with him a small chest of bronze that smelled like tide and thunder. He showed the boy how currents twine around the ankles of islands, how a storm can be read by the lean of distant smoke, how a king survives cholera and rumors alike by learning to see the larger shape of movement. He said his name once, and the cave itself seemed to forget it, but the boy remembered. Oceanus. Later, a woman came who wore no jewels and always knew which phrase would open a locked mouth. She moved as if thought itself had chosen to walk and take tea with the mountain. She taught the boy riddles and then taught him how to refuse to answer them, how to wait, how to smile without surrender. The nymphs called her Metis and did not ask where she slept when she left the cave and went back to the halls that float on the rim of the world. The child watched her hands as she worked with herbs and with the shades of words, and understood that some victories are brewed. As he grew, the world began to bend toward him without realizing that it bent at all. When he stood at the cave mouth, the oak bowed as if a storm had paused to listen. When he walked along the ledges that ran like knifebacks across the mountain, the ravens turned their heads and tracked him with a scholar's suspicion. He wrestled with Adrastea's goat and let the animal throw him into the dust, and then learned the exact way its neck muscles gathered before the toss and used that knowledge to stand. He climbed to the ice line and watched the cloud shadows chase each other across the shoulders of Ida and Dicte. He leaped a ravine and felt for a moment the cold honesty of the sky that had once been his grandfather and would always be his enemy. He learned to hurl a stone so that it skipped more times than seemed possible, and to throw a spear so that it sang a bright note at the edge of its flight. He promised nothing out loud, but inside himself he made a list, and his list was long. The education of a god is never only a matter of skill. He learned stories. Adrastea told him how Uranus had pressed his monstrous brothers into the belly of the earth, and how Gaia had begged her children to take up a blade. Ida told him about Titan laughter that rang across the plains and drew wolves from their dens, and about table talk in Othrys, where queens spoke about virtue with honey on their lips and stones in their chests. Metis told him about the uses of waiting and the mechanics of fear. She said that a king with a prophecy lodged in his throat will starve himself of trust and call it prudence. She said that people will bring you their loyalty if you give them a story in which they can place their names, and that the wrong story will burn you faster than any forge. She told him about a cup. Zeus learned to wear a plain cloak that could pass in any village, and to move among shepherds without drawing the eye, and to sit in the back of a hall like a shadow that knows it can fill a room when it wishes. He saw men share their bread, and women share their grief, and he heard the way a mother breathes when she decides to hold her child and live. Not because hope is bright, but because in that hour there is no other choice. He watched goats taken by a thin-bodied fever that went from hooves to heart in a day, and he learned that death moves faster than law. He felt the ground shake under his feet, and put his ear to the dirt, and felt a deeper shaking. There were brothers in there. There were voices in stone and fists like boulders, beating time in the dark. He asked Gaia without words, and she answered him without speech. The answer was patience. For now, when he was grown enough to wear a sword on his hip and make it look like an ornament rather than a threat, Rhea sent for him. The message came in the form of a white rope of wool laid across the cave mouth at dawn, a pattern that only he and his mother could read. He left the cave before the nymphs woke and climbed down to a grove where the air smelled of crushed mint and old rain. Rhea waited with a face that a sculptor would have broken his hands trying to capture. They ate figs in silence. She told him that the palace was still grand and cold, and that Cronus was still a king who could feed 100 tables and could not feed his own soul. She told him that his sisters and brothers lived in a chamber that was not a chamber, that there was music at court and no laughter at night. She looked at him once without speaking, and for that moment he was a child again, and then he was not. She told him that secrets need to walk, or they become stones that crush their owners. She asked him if he was ready, and he said yes, and felt the words settle like iron inside him. Metis came at dusk and did not bow to Rhea because she bowed to no one. She laid out herbs and roots on a cloth and crushed them with a flat stone. The smell that rose was bitter and contained the memory of riverbanks and patient illnesses. She turned to the young god and said that the strongest emetic is truth, and the second strongest is fear, and that she would use both. She told him that she could brew a draught that would make Cronus cough up everything he held, and that the trick would be to place it in his hands in such a way that he would lift it to his own mouth. A cupbearer can pour any story into a room. A cupbearer can poison a tyrant or crown him again each evening. She made the cup black, even when wine would be red in it, and she taught Zeus how to smile, like a servant who believes that he will never be a king. He entered Othrys by a door that most did not see, through a kitchen that could have fed an army of rivers, and through a hall where braziers kept a controlled fire that had been stolen from the first lightning. The palace remembered him without knowing it remembered. The stone under his feet hummed once the way an old hound will thump its tail when a friend returns. He kept his head bowed and his hands steady. He watched the faces that turned to him as he passed with a tray. Some held curiosity. Some showed nothing. A few showed fear, because fear recognizes its natural predator. He stood at the edge of the throne room as musicians tuned and dancers waited for their moment and courtiers discussed the fates of islands as if they were chessmen. Rhea sat like winter beside the throne and looked down at the floor because she had learned that to look up is to give away too much. Cronus entered with a train of attendants that would have choked the throat of a modest city. He mounted the dais with the grace of a man who had never known a day without power. He wore a crown of obsidian that swallowed the light and gave nothing back. He leaned on the arm of the throne and smiled at nothing in particular. Zeus approached with a pitcher and a cup. He poured the wine so that the thin stream made that sound that men begin to crave after only a few storms and wars. the sound that means safety and forgetting. He held the cup with both hands the way a child holds a task he is proud to complete. Cronus took it without looking. Zeus saw the hands that had held his sisters and brothers and felt a tightness in his chest that he learned to name only years later. He did not speak. He stood and waited. Cronus drank. His throat worked. The music swelled. The hall turned to light and motion. The poison went down into the kingdom that was the king. What followed is told differently by different singers, but the spine of the tale is the same. Cronus felt a tightness rise from the pit of his being and spread through the chambers where he kept what he did not deserve. He coughed once and his hand went to his chest. He coughed again and his courtiers leaned forward as if a joke were about to land. He tried to smile at them and found that his face no longer obeyed his intentions. A third convulsion took him, and he stood with both hands on the arms of the throne and heaved. He vomited a stone wrapped in old cloth, and the stone bounced on the steps of the dais and rang like a bell. He vomited a goddess. Hestia fell to the floor with a cry like fire finding dry wood. She rolled to her knees and stood, and her eyes were the color of coal that remembers flame. Then Demeter came out of darkness and stood with straw in her hair, as if she had been traveling through the corridors of every future harvest. Then Hera, with a gaze that cut right and left. Then Hades, who did not blink and made the candles dim with his first breath. Then Poseidon, whose laugh startled the bronze on the walls and made a bowl spill. The hall went mad. Rhea covered her mouth and did not fall. Themis stood without moving and felt the balance of the world shift a fraction. Mnemosyne began to catalogue every heartbeat. Cronus staggered and tried to speak. His words came out as a hiss, and no one later remembered what he said because the sound of 6 living gods breathing drowned it. Zeus stepped back and let the truth arrange the room by its own gravity. Hestia looked at him and recognized him as the boy she had not known. Demeter touched his shoulder and smiled, not at the past, but at the one field she could now see becoming possible. Hera looked at him and measured the ways in which he might be a king worthy of fear and love. Hades looked at him and saw through him into the contracts that would one day bind kings and beggars alike. Poseidon embraced him as a brother embraces another who has pulled them both from a flood. Rhea finally let air into her lungs, and for a moment the scent of pine resin and fresh rain filled the hall. Cronus reached for the sickle that was not there. He called for guards who did not come quickly enough because the sound in the room was louder than commands. The proud ones among the Titans stepped back and put expressions upon their faces that could later be called misunderstanding. The few who were brave enough to choose a side took one step and waited for someone else to take the second. Zeus felt a sensation like a sky split by a first bolt run through his bones and out into the world. He had not raised a hand. He had poured a cup. He had waited. He had freed what was his own. The old throne looked suddenly like a chair too small for the figure that would soon sit in it or smash it to grit. The siblings spoke briefly behind a column where party smoke curled and drifted around them like a lazy ghost. Hestia said that the first fire should be kept for all. Demeter said that the earth would answer a gentle hand better than a whip. Hera said that justice without strength is a harvest that feeds no one, and that strength without justice is a harvest that poisons the children. Hades said that promises have to be enforceable, and that he had thoughts about the building of a realm where debts could be ended rather than endlessly carried. Poseidon said that he wanted a kingdom that moved and broke and sighed like a living thing, and that he would make it so. Zeus listened and took from each of them something that would show in him years later. Then he went to find Metis. She was already in the doorway of a servants' hall, with that expression that means a plan has reached its natural limit and now courage must finish what craft began. She told him that the room was about to catch fire without flame, and that fools were going to die. She told him that one victory does not end a reign, but that it opens the door to a war, which had been waiting by the hearth for years. She said that tomorrow is a weapon, and that the men and women who survive are those who remember that while everyone else is celebrating. He asked her to come with him, and she smiled and said that she had been with him since he first learned to tell when a goat would move its head. The two of them looked back once at the throne, and then left without arranging their faces into any expression at all. A servant watching them later could not tell if they had been afraid or calm, only that they moved, as if the ground on which they walked had agreed to carry them. Outside Othrys, the night was clear, and the stars were pinned in patterns that Hyperion would have named in a lecture filled with pride and ache. Zeus breathed in the cold air and felt a rumble in the distance that most ears could not hear. It was the sound of chains sliding over stone and of hands with 100 fingers waking. He knelt and touched the ground, and the ground answered with a shiver that ran up his arm and stood the hairs on his neck. He told the night that he would be back for them. He told the soil that he would break it open and feed it with truth and receive, in return, a world that had room for more than fear. The night kept its counsel. The mountain regarded him and said nothing. A fox ran across a lower path and did not look up. Rhea came out by a different door and stood beside her son and did not speak for a long time. She watched the windows of the palace and saw shadows cross and recross them. She thought of a time when a woman had to set a stone against her own breasts and pretend that it was her child and sing to it as if it could hear. She thought of the curve of a horn that gives more the more it is emptied. She set her hand on Zeus's shoulder and felt the knot of muscle there and the deeper knot that was made of promises. She wanted to tell him to run. She wanted to tell him to stay. She said instead the only true thing that a mother can say to a son in that hour: be who you are, and then be more. At dawn, he went to a high ridge with his sisters and brothers and looked out over a world that had not yet learned his name but would. The light came over the peaks and laid a path of gold along every river it could touch. Birds rose and fell like small thoughts. In the far distance, a ripple ran through a field, as if a god had passed his hand just beneath the surface of the earth. Zeus did not raise his arm in triumph or shout. He closed his eyes and listened to the sound of the wind through spruce and the low breath of a valley. And then he opened them and went down toward the day that would ask him to choose every hour whether he wished to be a king or a man or something larger than both. The first noise of war was not a trumpet or a cry. It was the whisper of prophecy waking in the bones of the world. The halls of Othrys still shook with the echo of a king who had tried and failed to keep the future in his stomach. The corridors of Olympus, which until that hour had been only a rumor on a high ridge, filled with the breath of 6 gods and a 7th, who walked among them like a storm that had learned patience. Men were not yet born to number the days, but the sky counted in its own way, and the earth felt the tally in its faults and seams. The two mountains looked at one another across valleys and rivers and the glittering lakes of Thessaly, and between them grew a field that would take the weight of giants and the weight of new kings. A wind came from the east one morning and dragged a sheet of cloud across the plain, and in the hush that followed the cloud the first spear was lifted. Zeus did not rush to that spear. He went first to those whose names would matter in the long counting. He walked with Themis to a place where 2 streams met and did not quarrel, and he placed his hand upon the water and swore that his rule would be bound to law or it would not last. Themis set her palm upon his, and the streams crossed and braided together for a moment, and then unbraided, as if they had learned a lesson about balance. Mnemosyne was asked to remember, not only the bright acts, but the dark ones, and she nodded, for she had always remembered even when the remembering hurt. Styx came up from the underworld and stood on a bank that smelled of cold iron and winter leaves, and she offered more than witness. She brought her children, Zelus and Nike and Kratos and Bia, zeal and victory and strength and force, and they bowed to Zeus as the first allies to answer his call. In return, he promised that those who swore by Styx would be bound by the deepest oath the cosmos would ever know. To this day, when a god swears upon that river, the oath does not break without breaking the one who made it. There were embassies that moved like shadows across the world before the first missiles flew. Oceanus sent word that his waters would not take sides. He did not love Cronus, and he did not trust the young thunder, but he loved the circle of the world more than either, and the rivers that sprang from his crown were told to run true no matter what chariots tried to ford them. Tethys nodded in her quiet way and sent her daughters to bring drink to both camps, as if reminding the fighters that thirst can undo an army faster than any spear. Prometheus came by night to the edge of a new camp on Olympus, and sat by a small fire with a boy who wore no crown yet. The Titans spoke as a craftsman speaks, without ornament and without fear. He told Zeus that victory belongs to those who think 2 steps ahead and are brave enough to move 1 step back when they must. He told him that pity can be a blade if held properly. Epimetheus stood behind his brother and looked at the stars as if they were lamps in a high ceiling, and tried to decide whether they were closer than they looked or farther. Themis welcomed both brothers, and Metis asked them questions until Prometheus smiled for the first time in years. Zeus sent heralds to Othrys with terms that sounded like mercy and like warning. Cronus sat upon his high seat with the old calm pulled across his face like a soft coat. He would not yield the Cyclopes or the 100-handed ones. He would not return the sickle to the earth. He would not swear by Styx. He would not even say the name of the sun he had underestimated. Around him gathered the Titans who found pride a better companion than wisdom. Hyperion stood with his shoulders straight and his face bright as sunrise, and Thea by his side shone with a beauty that did not waver. Coeus sharpened his quiet thoughts and looked for a way to win by geometry. Crius rolled his shoulders like a man who has learned to read the wind by the taste of dust. Iapetus smiled with that thin smile that belongs to those who mistake ruin for strength. Menoetius of the violent heart stood at Iapetus's left hand and spoke of recklessness as if it were a sacrament. Atlas was given the task of marshalling the vanguard because even his enemies trusted him to carry heavy things without complaint. When talk was finished, the forging began. It is true that the greatest weapons of the Olympians would come from hands not yet free, but there were tools enough for an opening act. The new gods dressed themselves in bronze and in leather, cured with cedar, smoke, and salt. Poseidon set a length of ash to iron and balanced it until it agreed with his wrist. Hades took a spear with a head that narrowed to a point like a question only he could answer. Hera carried a staff that ended in a lotus and a hook in equal measure. Demeter bound her hair and set a blade at her belt that looked simple until it cut, and Hestia made a hearth at the center of the camp so that every warrior would breathe a breath that reminded him of home before he slept. Zeus did not wear a crown. He carried a staff of mountain oak and a short sword on his hip, and above his shoulders the sky listened when he spoke and sometimes answered with a growl. The first clash came at a low valley where 3 streams met, and a stand of poplar watched like thin white ghosts. The Titans advanced in a line that gleamed with arrogance. Atlas moved like a stone that had decided to grow legs. Hyperion sent spears of light that burned the eyes of the first rank of the Olympian guard. The earth shook when Menoetius laughed and charged. Kratos and Bia met that charge and stopped it when their shoulders hit his ribs with the sound of a tree splitting. Nike ran along the front like a breath of winter, and whenever her feet touched the ground, a soldier found the courage to move forward another pace. Zeus raised his arm, and the dark above him thinned, and a sound like cloth tearing rolled over the plain. Rain came in a sudden sheet that turned dust to slick clay, and the Titans who moved by habit found their feet mutinous. Poseidon struck the ground with the butt of his spear, and a wet trench opened between the lines and filled to the brim, and the first rank of Othris splashed to a halt, surprised to learn that a river can be made in an hour when a god demands it. There were days when the fighting looked like two storms colliding and cancelling one another out. There were nights when both camps listened to the same wolves. The siege was not a wall of stone around a city. It was a pressure felt in the chest of every river and in the ribs of each mountain that lay between the great camps. Zeus sent small bands to take high ground and keep it, to peel away lesser titans who had more ambition than loyalty. He placed Themis in charge of oaths among his followers, and no man or god who broke her measures was allowed to share bread again until he had paid in service for his lie. Hera learned the names of those who wavered and spoke to them with a queen's melody that could make a coward blush and a brave man stand taller. Demeter walked each new trench after the digging and taught the soldiers to plant quick barley in the topsoil, so that every fortification became both wall and field. Hestia kept fires lit during rains that would have smothered any other flame, and gave stew to a boy who would in 3 days save a line of 50 when he refused to run. Hades counted the dead with a precision that made living men straighten their shoulders when he passed, because he looked at them with the strict attention a ledger gives to a name. On the other side, Cronus was not idle. He sent Crius to command the winds and worry the flanks. Coeus laid out lines on maps and spoke of angles and paths of least resistance, and sometimes his math put an enemy waist deep in the wrong river. Hyperion scorched whole hillsides so that the next sunrise would find the Olympians exposed and aching. Iapetus released a rumor that Zeus had no true courage, and it flew around the plains for a day the way a cheap bird will circle a carcass, only to be swatted from the air when Kratos dragged Menoetius from a chariot and held him to the ground until his pride bled into the soil. Atlas led 3 assaults on the same graveled ridge and was thrown back each time, not by strength alone, but by a pattern of cairns placed by Metis that confused the eye and made it hard to judge the distance between one heartbeat and the next. There were moments when the old ties showed fissures. Themis and Mnemosyne walked into the camp of Othries under a flag that was a plain white cloth, and no one dared harm them because even a tyrant looks over his shoulder when law and memory come into his tent. They asked Cronus to end it. He gave them wine and spoke of dogs who must be beaten to learn their place. They left without drinking. In the same season, a messenger slipped into Zeus's camp from the direction of Iapetus and said that Prometheus and Epimetheus would not fight against their mother's kin, but neither would they raise a sword in defense of a creed that ate its own children. Zeus nodded and told the messenger to tell Prometheus that the age would soon need a builder more than it needed another general. The messenger smiled and went back into the dark. As months became years in the counting that only gods can make, the battles etched names into the map. There was the day of falling stones along the flank of Mount Ossa, when Cronus ordered the cliffs to let go and the hills obliged, and the Olympians moved like dancers from boulder to boulder across the back of a living avalanche. There was the long push upon the plain near the Peneus, when the Titans advanced behind shields that shone like the moon, and Hades walked forward alone with a spear held low, and the air around him cooled, and the front rank of Othries shuddered and stepped back, because they felt something they could not name and did not like. There was a night in which a red moon rose, and the owls turned their heads away from the camp of Zeus, as if unwilling to witness. And in that hour, 2 lesser gods of the old order betrayed their sentries and opened a gate. And 3 hours later they lay bound at the feet of Nike, and Zeus pardoned one and sent the other to Styx to swear a penitent oath. And Themis said yes to the first and no to the second, and that decision saved a flank in a battle 3 summers later that no one could have predicted. A siege is a patience game played with mountains as counters. Zeus learned to listen to silence. He kept his eyes upon the line of Othries, and his ears tuned to the unhappiness of Gaia beneath. There were tremors from the deep chambers where the Cyclopes and the 100-handed ones still sat in their fetters. Sometimes at night he would wake with his palm pressed to the ground and feel a distant pounding like the drum of rain upon a far sea. He dreamed once of a forge that shook the roots of a mountain and of sparks that were not only fire but also ideas. He told no one that the dream had come to him, because a commander who shares all his dreams makes his soldiers feel briefly warm and then permanently afraid. He spoke instead of ration counts and road repairs and honor paid to the fallen, and his people loved him for it, and also because when he passed a man at a fire, he knew his name. Cronus learned other lessons. He learned that fear is a poor glue for broken loyalties. He learned that satiety is not the same as joy. He learned that the promise that no one would ever challenge him again if he won this one war was a lie told to him by his own fear. He learned none of these things well enough to save himself. He went often to the highest tower of Othries and stared into the distance where the cloud that always seemed to hang above Olympus kept its place like a tame beast at a threshold, and he felt anger the way a man feels gravel in his teeth. Rhea kept her counsel. She walked the terraces of the palace and spoke to the vines, and sometimes they answered her by growing in a way that spoiled a carefully planned sightline. She offered prayers to a motherhood that had cost her everything and took little solace in the few moments of quiet that came before dawn. She did an act of mercy now and then that no one knew, and those acts were enough to keep her human in a place where the walls pressed hard upon the soul. The years of stalemate were not empty. They were an education writ large upon the living world. Zeus learned the cost of asking others to die for the story that had brought him to this place. He learned that a leader must sometimes forgive what the law cannot, and sometimes punish what pity would rather excuse. He learned that a storm may be called, but cannot be controlled once it arrives, unless the caller knows its true name. Poseidon discovered that the sea inside him answered to the moon even when Selene did not yet ride in her silver car, and he began to speak to tides and to listen when they answered. Hades invented contracts that could not be twisted by clever tongues, and he found that the very act of writing such a compact steadied his hands. Hera set up a court at the edge of the camp where grievances were heard and decided with speed and with a memory for faces, and thus kept small angers from becoming larger ones. Demeter brought green to places that war had blackened and made soldiers weep quietly over a bowl of stew because they tasted in it the thing they fought for without knowing they fought for it. Prometheus came again and again by secret tracks and brought with him a handful of designs for shelters and for slings, for bridges of rope and for ovens that could be dug in an hour and feed 100. Themis approved the sharing of some tricks and the secrecy of others. Metis sat at the edge of the map table and asked questions that made strong men admit that their assumptions rested on nothing but habit. Mnemosyne began to recite aloud each morning the names of those who had fallen, and the camp would halt and stand in silence while she spoke. And at the end, the gods and the lesser immortals would answer not with a shout but with a breath, and that breath gave the living a measure that was not dramatic but was true. It could have continued forever, two mountains staring at one another, while years died like sparks in a chimney. It did not. Gaia had been patient, but patience is not the same as consent. She had asked first for justice from Uranus, and then for justice from Cronus. She had watched a son become a king, and then become a jailer. She had allowed another son to grow in secret, and had seen him loosen the locks upon the future. Now she moved again, not with the sudden rage that births monsters in a moment, but with the steady will of an earth that knows what is buried in her and knows what must be unearthed. She came to Zeus in a dream that smelled of rain on basalt and of the first green that follows a burn. She showed him the walls inside the world, where the Cyclopes sat with their single eyes open and unblinking in the dark. She showed him the 100-handed ones with wrists the size of tree trunks and fingers that could pick up mountains like pebbles. She did not need to tell him that a war fought without them would grind on until all songs were ash. Zeus woke before dawn and went out to stand where the slope drops away and the sky seems near enough to cut. The camp slept behind him with the ragged breathing of an army that has learned to rest in shreds. He felt the pull downward, toward the root of things. He thought of the promise he had made in the shallow confluence, where Themis taught him that law is a weight that must be carried. He thought of the first oath to Styx, and of the way the water had felt on his hand. He thought of a goat with a broken horn, and of the first time he had thrown a spear and heard it sing. He thought of his sisters, who had learned to fight and to heal in the same hour, and of his brothers, who were ready to break the sea and the night if he asked. He did not think of his father except as a locked door that must finally be opened. By mid-morning he had called his council and told them what Gaia had shown. Hera studied his face and saw that he was already walking the path he described. Demeter folded her hands and asked what would be planted after the freeing was done. Hades said only that he would stand where he must stand and would count what must be counted. Poseidon grinned with an eagerness that made the canvas of the tent tremble. Themis approved the plan with a single nod. Metis smiled, a small smile that meant the hard part was about to begin. Nike touched Zeus on the shoulder with 2 fingers and said that victory enjoys company but despises haste. Kratos and Bia began to gather the teams that would carry the first ropes and the first chains, and the first wedges that would hold open a gate that had never been opened since the world first learned to have rooms. That night, the camp on Olympus burned with small fires that did not show from Othrys because of a trick that Prometheus and Metis had devised from the way certain leaves smoke when damp. Zeus walked the perimeter and said the word, "Go to men and women who had been waiting for it for years." The stars wheeled in their ancient paths, and the moon rose white and unaware. A fox trotted down a path and stopped and looked at him without fear, and then went on. The ridgeline of the mountain was a black teeth line against a paler black, and beyond that line lay the long path to the doors that keep the deep places. He did not hurry. He did not speak again. He went forward as a man goes forward to meet a judge who may be a friend. Night held the mountain like a secret while the campfires of Olympus burned low and steady, and in that careful, dark Zeus set out with those who understood that the straight road was not always the wise one. The path he chose did not lead toward Othrys, or toward any of the bright outworks where the Titans kept their banners and their proud spears. It led downward into the old earth, along clefts where the air smelled of metal and wet ash, past caverns that were older than the quarrels of gods, past pools that reflected no sky at all. Hades walked first. not as a king of anything yet, but as a man who knows the architecture of quiet. Demeter came behind him with a torch that did not smoke and a gaze that measured the soil even in darkness. Hera moved as if walls could not stop her. Poseidon kept his palm against the stone and listened for the slow complaint of bedrock. Themis and Mnemosyne followed side by side, law and memory keeping pace. Metis lifted her cloak against the chill and said little, which was when she was most dangerous. Zeus moved among them and not ahead of them, which was why they would follow him later when the world tilted and asked for an answer. They reached the black chasm that is not so much a place as a judgment. Even gods hesitate at the lip of Tartarus. Hesiod would someday tell mortals that if a bronze anvil were dropped from the clear sky, it would fall for 9 days before striking earth, and fall 9 days more before touching the floor of this pit. That is as close as language will come to the distance they faced. There was no bridge. There was a path that wound down along the inner skin of the abyss, a thread cut by something ancient with fingers that did not tire. The party began the descent, one behind another, while a wind rose that had never felt sunlight. They passed pillars so old that even Mnemosyne could not name their maker. They passed caverns that sighed with heat and others that breathed frost. They came at last to a land where the very darkness seemed forged, where the air had the taste of iron filings and the faint scent of lightning after a storm. Here the bronze gate stood, set into a wall that might as well have been the back of the world. Each leaf of the gate was thicker than a tower is wide. The hinges were carved in shapes that hurt the eye. Across the doors lay chains longer than rivers, their links stamped with the names of the first fears. The guardian stepped forward before anyone could touch iron. She was not large in the way of mountains or seas. She was large in the way a nightmare is large to a child who cannot move. Her name had been forgotten in the high stories of courts, but the deep places remembered it, and the nymphs would later whisper it when they wished to mark a threshold that must not be crossed without courage. Camp. Her hair moved in cords that were not hair. Her eyes looked in 2 directions at once. She wore bells that made a sweet sound while she readied the end of any intruder. Her tail coiled like a question asked by a scholar who intends to tear the answer from the throat of truth. She smiled when she saw the gods. She had waited a long time for anything worthy of fear. Hades did not speak to her of duty. He would one day be a master of contracts, but this was not an hour for parchment. Kratos and Bia came forward with long hooks of tempered bronze and sank them into the first of the chains and pulled, not to break them, but to make a noise that would hide other sounds. Zeus took 3 steps left without looking at the ground and 3 steps right as if he had tested this floor 100 times. Campe watched his hands. That was her mistake. Poseidon slammed the butt of his spear into the rock, and the veins of the earth answered him with a sudden tremor that made even gods flex their knees. The wall shifted its weight, just enough. Metis flicked powder into the air, and a gust caught it and pushed it into the guardian's eyes, where it became a cloud of memories that did not belong to her. She saw a grove she had never visited, a child she had never nursed, a storm that had never wet her hair. Her smile faltered. For an instant, the bells on her hips forgot their task. Hades moved. He went not around her but through the space between her thoughts, which is the narrowest passage in the world. When he came out the other side, he held a length of chain that had been set to the gate at the beginning of this age. He wrapped it around her to remind her of something she had always loved and had called service. She roared and struck. The irons sang. Zeus lifted his arm and the air answered him. Light came, not as a bolt yet, but as a white wound. It struck the ground at her feet, and the floor shattered into plates. Camp fell to one knee. Bia shoved the hooked chain into a crack and leaned her entire will into it while Kratos drove a wedge with a hammer brought for this purpose. And the chain parted with a sigh that sounded almost grateful. The bronze leaves opened inward with a breath of heat that tasted like copper. The first thing that spilled out was not a creature but a sound. It was the steady rhythm of fists beating stone, a slow drum that had learned not to hope and learned it so well that it sounded like a prayer anyway. The gods stepped through with care. The chamber beyond was the color of coals when the cook thinks the fire is dead and is wrong. 3 figures sat with their backs to the same wall, each bound with ropes that had not been woven but hammered, each gaunt in the way only immortals can be gaunt, which is to say that nothing of them had diminished except their faith. Argies lifted his head first, and the single eye in the center of his forehead opened like a kiln door. Brontes turned his face, and the scars across his cheeks looked like lightning that had refused to leave. Steropes raised his hand and sparks fell from his palm to the floor and died there, as if embarrassed to have come from a hand so tired. Zeus spoke their names, each with the ancient accent that makes a name feel like a promise kept. He did not order their chains cut. He asked for them. Brontes smiled without mirth and said that he had been waiting for the boy who would speak like that. Hades laid his palms upon the bonds, and the metal forgot its purpose. Bia lifted Arges to his feet with the gentle strength she never showed in battle lines. Demeter poured water over Steropes' wrists, and the welts hissed, and then did not. The 3 Cyclopes stood, and the light in the room gathered around them whether they wished it or not. They had been called monsters by those who feared what a maker can do. They were smiths. Every hammer that ever found the head of a nail would owe them a debt, though the hammer would not know it. There were other doors beyond the first. Through them the party found the brothers with the 100 hands and the 50 heads, the ones Uranus had buried and Cronus had not freed. Cottus stirred when he smelled air that had not been breathed 1,000 times by the same lungs. Gyges blinked until his 50 sets of eyes agreed on a single focus. Briareus dragged a chain so heavy that lesser gods would have named it mountain, and he held it like a toy because to him it was an old insult. They were terrifying even to those who had come to love them before they met them. They were also gentle to those who touched their chains. Hestia, who had waited at the bronze doors and kept a small fire going in case someone should come out hungry, stepped forward and pressed a piece of baked barley into Briareus's palm. He put his thunderous head down and ate it slowly, and after the last crumb his eyes were wet. Zeus did not unbind the 100-handed without terms. He spoke as a prince of the earth and as a son of a mother who had begged for justice since the first cruelty. He asked the 3 to join him, not for a day or a month, but until the chains on their souls felt honest. He promised that if he prevailed, their hands would no longer be turned toward tearing the world, but toward holding shut the doors that should never again be opened to tyranny. Cottus nodded and the sound was a landslide. Gyges laughed and the echoes ran ahead of the party for 1,000 paces. Briareus said only the word yes, and the word held the weight of a cliff. The Cyclopes did not ask for new chains. They asked for an anvil and a place to set it, and for bellows, and for a river of air. Arges scouted the cavern and found a fault where the rock was already warm with the memories of old fires. Brontes set the anvil down and the stone under it remembered its purpose. Steropes knelt and struck the first spark, and felt it climb jubilant upon his arm until it sat in his palm like a tame star. They worked without music because the work itself poured a rhythm into the air. The party watched, and when the heat became too fierce for eyes, Hades lowered his lids and listened instead. The Cyclops spoke to one another in the short phrases of masters who do not need to explain. Metal came out of rock, the way a dream comes out of a tired mind at dawn. The bellows pulled in air and pushed out a wind that carried the breath of thunder. Shapes took form that had never been set upon any table. They made the thunderbolt first, because the bolt had already begun to be born in the hand of Zeus when he had cast light at a guardian. Arges took a rod of a metal that did not exist until he willed it and hammered it until it was thin and alive. Brontes wove threads of brightness through that rod, like a woman weaving hair with a ribbon. Steropes lifted the whole and spoke to it, not in words, but with the arc of his forearm and the opening of his fingers. The thing in his grasp awoke, with a sound like 1,000 banners snapping to attention. He took a set of tongs and pressed the newborn weapon into a basin carved from stone and filled with a rain that had fallen inside the cavern when there was no sky. Steam rose. When it cleared, the thunderbolt lay upon the anvil as if it wished to stand. Arges nodded to Zeus without ceremony. He reached out and took it. It did not burn him. It climbed his arm like a trained hawk and settled upon his shoulder, and then dissolved into the air around him until only a faint taste of metal remained upon the tongue of anyone who stood nearby. For Poseidon, the Cyclops made a spear that was more than a spear. It was a forked length of tempered rage that had slept under oceans since the earth first found the word salt. Arges watched the opening and closing of Poseidon's hands and cut the haft to a span that would pull at the shoulders, just enough to remind the god of the weight of authority. Brontes balanced the prongs until a downward thrust would open the ground, and an upward toss would call water from the farthest bay. Steropes quenched the trident in a tub of brine taken from a spring that had never seen light, and said 2 syllables that tasted like storm. When Poseidon took the weapon, the room seemed to swell and narrow at the same time, as if the world were a chest learning to breathe. For Hades, they forged a gift that was not a blade and not a staff, a cap that did not shine and did not reflect. They worked at this in silence, and with a care that made even Zeus step back. Arges shaped the metal until it remembered shadow better than light. Brontes polished it until it disappeared against his palm, even though his hand was right there in front of them. Steropes set it upon the anvil and spoke to the place behind the eyes where fear lives, not to summon fear, but to teach it respect. When Hades took the helm, he felt the room move farther away and closer at once. He put it on, and the chamber sighed as if relieved to be rid of him. He removed it, and the breath returned. There is a reason that later poets would call it the helm of darkness. It did not create night. It asked the world to forget what it saw for a little while. The Cyclops did not finish with these 3. They made for Hera a spear that could strike pride without spilling blood, and she smiled because that was a weapon she would use even more cleverly than steel. They made for Demeter a sickle of clean curve and honest weight, to harvest and to remind all those who saw it that the earth gives and the earth can also take. For Hestia, they shaped a small brazier that would never go cold unless she let it, and which could give a mouthful of warmth to a soldier who was far from any civilized hearth. For Athena, who had not yet come fully into her hour but already watched from the edges of plans, they set aside a shield that would one day carry a face that stops fools in their tracks. The forge sang. The gods listened and learned. The return to the upper world was not a procession. It was an eruption held in check by Zeus and Themis and Metis, because if you let 100 hands throw mountains before you have decided where the peaks must fall, you will kill as many friends as enemies. The party moved with dwindled torches. Behind them marched Cottus and Gyges and Briareus. whose footsteps troubled the dreams of things that have never feared anything. The bronze gates of Tartarus closed, and in that closing a promise was made that one day those same hands would hold them shut against anyone who wished to use them as a door for cruelty. Campe lay bound and quietly breathing, her bells making a small music that sounded like the end of a bad season. War does not pause for awe. Word of the freeing ran like crack fire through brush. Titans swore, and some prayed for the first time since they had traded the habit for power. Atlas turned his head toward Othris and felt a weight settle upon his shoulders that was not yet the weight he would carry later, but that taught him its shape. Hyperion gathered light into spears and cast them at the clouds that were gathering over the enemy camp. Coeus laid new lines upon his maps in the hope that arithmetic could defeat the multiplication of hands. Iapetus called his sons, and they came. Menoetius, with his eyes lit from within by the belief that courage is the same thing as fury. Prometheus, with his brow folded by thought. Epimetheus, smiling at a story no one had yet told him. Cronus watched the sky and decided that the time for words had ended. The first day of the renewed fighting belonged to noise. Zeus raised his arm, and the air answered with a cut that left sailors clutching their ears in distant bays. The thunderbolt leaped and tore a scar in the world that would take a season to heal. Where it struck, a phalanx came apart like straw. Poseidon drove the tines of his spear into the ground, and a ridge buckled, and a new ravine opened and ran with cold water within the hour. Hades put on his cap and stepped through the front line of Othris with calm strides. And a moment later, the gate behind that line was unbarred, because a frightened lieutenant had found himself confronted by a presence that made him forget his loyalty and remember his mother. Hera took a small hill without drawing blood by naming every coward she could see and then naming their better selves so clearly that they chose to be those men. Demeter spread green along the embankments, and the hearts of those who defended them rose, because they could smell bread again. Hestia kept the cook fires dry under a rain that would have crushed other flames, and in that small mercy a dozen heroes were made in the hour before dawn. The Titans answered in kind. Hyperion sent lances of brilliance that burned the eyes of archers for a day and night. Atlas struck with a column of soldiers so disciplined that even the gods nodded when they saw the line form and advance, and it required 3 of the 100-handed to break them, and even then Atlas brought most of his command away with spears intact. Caeus found a weakness in a ridge and used it to split a force of allies, so that they nearly fought one another in confusion before Nike ran among them and put right the names of their enemies. Menoetius charged. He did not look left or right. He spoke prayers to violence and to the satisfaction of impact. Zeus saw him and felt a responsibility that no one else could carry. The thunderbolt fell again, and Menoetius met it with arms open and was thrown back as if he had been made of paper and was sent to a night deeper than the night on any field. Iapetus saw his son fall and learned that there are debts even Titans cannot collect. Cottus and Gyges and Briareus made the air populous with stones. They threw boulders the way hunters throw pebbles at crows, casual and accurate and remorseless. They tore up the tops of hills and hurled them so that the countryside would point in years to come at strange flat places and tell stories about how those hills learned to fly. They laughed, and their laughter was not kind. The very ground seemed to buck under the Titans' feet as the 100 hands kept time with a music only they could hear. It was not slaughter. It was not easy. It was the turn of a wheel that had needed many hands to move. The Cyclopes stayed at the forges and fed the fires and sent up a stream of iron that the smiths of Olympus shaped into points and hooks and plates and the parts of chariots that are under the paint and carry the weight. Arges watched the sky for the flicker that meant Zeus had called a bolt, and then he smiled each time he saw it and turned back to his anvil and struck harder with his hammer. There were councils each night that did not end in drinking. Themis set a plank on blocks and made of it a table where decisions were kept as clean as they could be in a world made of dust and blood. Metis asked questions until the proud forgot pride and the cautious forgot to hide their best ideas. Titanomachy read the names of those who had not come back and put her hand upon Zeus's shoulder once at the end of such a reading, and he did not move for a long time after. Hera walked the lines and listened to the smallest complaints, because she had learned that the smallest complaint can undo a city if it is not heard. Demeter mended the battered earth wherever she could, and soldiers found green shoots in the morning where there had been only dark earth at midnight, and it steadied them. Hades measured the debts of all and promised payment, which is the only way any kingdom remains a kingdom. Cronus felt the tilt and did what kings who are losing always do. He gathered his remaining strength and looked for one blow that would erase all the others. He went to the highest terrace of Othrys and stared out at a sky that would not meet his eyes. He called to the old powers that had once answered him. Some did not come. He sent word to those who had sat out the fight that there would be a reckoning later, whether they chose to move or not. He slept badly and woke with a mouth full of old iron. He called Atlas and Hyperion and Coeus and Crius and Iapetus, and he spoke to them of glory and of the shame of retreat, and they listened because they had always listened, and because there is a kind of glue in shared pride that no better substance can match. He told them that the fight would not be decided by 1,000 small wins, but by 1 hour that would be written or unwritten by the strong. Far from Othrys, in a tent that smelled of leather and laurel and careful hope, Zeus laid his hand upon the thunderbolt and felt it purr like a cat against his palm. He did not smile. He looked at his brothers and sisters and saw in them not destiny but effort. He thought of a goat in a cave and a horn that filled the world. He thought of a mother who had risked everything on a small wrapped bundle and a cup of bitter brew. He thought of chains and of the sound they made when they stopped being chains and became metal with no task. He did not pray, he stood. The night seemed to lean in to hear what the morning would bring. The last morning of the old order rose with a slow red light that stained the snows on Othrys and made the ravines look like fresh wounds. Cold wind pushed down from the peaks and lifted the banners of a house that had ruled since the first blade opened the first sky. The Titans stood upon their terraces and watched the plain where the armies gathered yet again, and they tasted iron in the air and the bitter edge of expectation. Cronus had not slept. He had walked the high galleries with the sickle that once had felled a father resting across his knees, and he had counted his victories the way a miser counts coins that are already promised away. When the sun showed itself at last, he set the blade down and felt the weight of prophecy sit beside him like an old companion. A child will overthrow you. The words had never left him. He listened to the mountain and heard no comfort in its stone. Zeus did not raise a shout when he came upon the field. He walked between his brothers and sisters as a man who knows that command is a vow spoken into the future. Hades paced at his right with the helm at his side and the calm of a ledger in his eyes. Poseidon strode at his left with the trident balanced in his hand and the sea breathing in his chest. Hera and Demeter and Hestia moved in step with Themis and Metis and Mnemosyne, law and cunning and memory at the core of every rank. Behind them came the Cyclopes with soot upon their forearms and a brightness in their single eyes that belongs only to makers who have brought new shapes into the world. Beyond them came Cottus and Gyges and Briareus, the hundred-handed ones, who had learned the slow dance of patience and were now ready to learn the faster music of ruin. The first hour belonged to thunder. Zeus lifted his arm and the sky obeyed. The bolt did not fall as a strike alone. It unstitched the air. It tore a scar in the day that turned heads in cities not yet founded. Where it landed, the ground leaped, and men fell to their knees, whether they were friends or foes, because there are sounds that will make any breast forget its loyalties for a moment. Poseidon thrust his spear into the crust of the plain, and a ridge heaved as if a sleeping colossus were turning beneath the soil. Water rushed through channels that had not existed the day before and pulled chariots into a sudden current. Hades drew the helm over his brow and was gone with a sigh of air. And in the next breath, a gate on the Titan flank opened, as if it had never been barred, and the defenders looked at each other with the uncertain eyes of men who have misplaced a key to a door that should never be opened. Cronus came down from Othrys with a column that looked like a cliff learning to walk. He did not speak. He wore a cloak the color of an old bruise, and he carried in his hand the blade that had cut the sky. Hyperion marched at his side and threw javelins of light that burned the eyes of archers and scorched the edges of shields. Atlas guarded the left with an order that made even enemy generals mark his formations with unwilling admiration. Coeus set traps for the feet of gods with angles and measured distances, and for a half-day his plans held. Iapetus called to his son, and Menoetius came with the look of a man who has found in rage a religion. The lines met and pressed and met again. Stone broke. Trees flew like birds. The air itself seemed to vibrate with history. When the last charge came, it did not announce itself with a trumpet. It came as a change in the pressure of the world. Cottus put his 100 hands to the ground and lifted a slope as if it were a rug and snapped it. Gyges picked up a rock the size of a tower and threw it as casually as a fisherman throws a net, and the rock found a rank of Titan shields and pressed them flat as leaves. Briareus uprooted a grove and hurled the trees into a barricade that could not be climbed and must be gone around, and by the time that column had gone around, the day had changed its mind. The Cyclopes stayed behind the lines, but their work walked into the fight. Helmets that had been plain now gleamed with a sober light that unsettled those who faced them. Armor that had been heavy now flexed as if it were woven from river and wind. A sling stone set by a new rule of balance left a shepherd's hand and struck a captain on the jaw, and the captain went down, and the men who had trusted his voice learned in a moment how loudly silence can speak. Zeus stepped into the clearing that had been made for him by the collapse of a wall and met Cronus under a sky that had learned new music. They did not speak. Fathers and sons talk in words when they still hope to change one another. These two had passed that season long ago. Cronus moved first, with a swing that would have cut a hill in half if a hill had been foolish enough to stand before it. Zeus let the sickle pass and felt the wind of it on his cheek, and remembered another night when that blade had sung, and he decided that a song can be ended. He raised his palm, and the bolt answered him with a voice that sounded like the tearing of a great sail. Cronus deflected the strike with the flat of his weapon, and his arm shook, and his teeth clicked together with the force. He smiled then, and it was the smile of a man who has lost many things, but never his taste for a worthy enemy. They fought in a circle of trampled earth that widened with every exchange. Around them, Hera broke a charge with a single word that made cowards hate themselves and brave men stand straighter. Demeter pulled a fence of reeds from the earth in a breath, and the reeds tangled the legs of a line that would have flanked the Olympians. Hades walked through a knot of defenders unseen, and laid his hand upon the bar of a second gate, and that gate opened, and the wind that came through it was cold as accounts settled. Poseidon cracked the plain, and a new channel rushed with water that tasted of salt, though there was no sea near, and the men who fell into it came up coughing and spitting and suddenly far from the fight. Themis stood upon a stone and declared an oath that no man would strike a prisoner upon pain of a punishment that would follow him past death. And even Titans within earshot obeyed before they realized they had obeyed. Mnemosyne named the dead as the hour rolled forward, and for each name a soldier found in himself the measure of another step. At last Cronus faltered. It was not a matter of strength alone. It was that the sickle in his hand remembered what it had done, and the blade grew heavy with its own history. Zeus saw the moment and did not hesitate. He called the bolt to his palm, and it gathered, quick and white, and he cast it at the weapon rather than at the hand that held it. The sickle shattered into 3 pieces that spun away and cut shallow scars in the ground. Cronus looked at his empty hand, and then at his son, and for the first time in his long rule, he let his shoulders drop. Zeus stepped forward and took him by the wrists. He did not strike him. He bound him with bands that had been forged in a deep hall where the air smelled of iron and rain, and the binding did not only hold flesh. It held a promise that the world had made to itself at the beginning, that a season must end, even if it believes that it is the only season possible. The route that followed was not clean and was not merciful. Atlas led his column out of the collapse with the ferocity of a man who refuses to shame the training he has spent 1,000 years perfecting. Hyperion threw one last spear of light, and then covered the retreat with a discipline that burned his own pride more than any wound. Coeus gathered the remnants of a plan and plotted a safe path across a broken field. Iapetus seized his fallen son and carried him like a bundle and did not look back. Many did not make it to the first ridge. More did not make it to the second. The 100-handed did not chase. They stood as if they had suddenly remembered a different task and were waiting for its name. The judgment did not take place in a frenzy. Themis would not allow it. The new court stood upon a patch of ground that had been mud in the morning and by noon had dried as if the sun had decided that justice is easier in a clean place. Rhea came and did not look at Cronus until she reached the foot of the stone where he stood bound. When she did look, the movement was small and steady. She did not speak to him. She spoke to the gods who had done the work he had forced upon them. She asked for a sentence that would not rot the core of the world. Themis answered that there is a prison that does not change its mind. Zeus nodded. The 100-handed ones stepped forward and lifted the bound Titans as if they were old bundles finally ready to be carried to the place that had always been waiting for them. The road to Tartarus had been walked before by a small company that had come with ropes and hooks and plans. Now it was walked by a procession that learned humility with every step. Cronus went first, held by Briareus with a gentleness that somehow hurt more than roughness would have done. Hyperion and Coeus and Crius and Iapetus followed. The daughters who had stood with justice and with memory were not bound. The old sea that had kept its circle was not molested. Prometheus and Epimetheus walked on the edge of the procession with their hands empty and their brows set. Atlas walked unbound by order of Zeus, flanked by Kratos and Bia, because his sentence had not yet been spoken and would be spoken at another place. The bronze gates opened to receive them. The Cyclopes stood aside, and the light on their faces was not triumph but completion. The chains already waited, coils upon coils, each link marked with runes that even gods read slowly. The first Titans stepped within and felt the temperature change, not to heat or to cold, but to a kind of perfect neutrality that rejected both pride and self-pity. Cottus and Gyges and Briareus took up their places in the thresholds like carved pillars, and their many hands set the bars with the certainty of a lock finding its final turn. When Cronus passed the last line of light, he turned once and looked at the shape of the world he had made, and the look was not pleading and not proud. It was the look of a man who is finally honest with himself in the single hour when honesty arrives too late to save anything. The gates shut. The noise was not loud. It was final. The ground above them stood still as if listening to the echo pass away through rock that would not answer. Themis set her palm upon the bronze and spoke a sentence that placed the 100-handed ones as jailers for as long as the gates needed to be kept closed. Sticks rose in a silvered spray from a crack in the stone and touched the seals, and the oaths made upon that touch took their places like guards who never sleep. There are stories that tell later of a season in which Cronus would be released and would rule again in a bright meadow where the good found rest. That story belongs to a future that had not yet learned its language. On that day the door was shut, and the key was thrown into a place that is not a place. Atlas received his judgment at the far edge of the world, where the sky leans down toward a horizon that looks like the rim of a great bowl. Zeus led him there with no heralds and no crowd, and together they looked out upon the endless blue that girdles the earth. Atlas did not beg. He asked only a question that shows why he was trusted with formations and with the difficult ends of plans. "What is the exact weight?" he said. Zeus answered him without flourish. "The weight is only the task itself." He lifted his palm and the dome of the sky shifted in its seat. Atlas stepped beneath it and set his shoulders against the curve of the heavens, and the vault settled onto him and found him sufficient. He did not groan. He breathed out once. The world heard that breath and took it for a wind and moved on. The camps broke after the sentences were carried out. Othrys stood empty, and the stones of its halls held the chill of a house that has lost its voice. Olympus was quiet in victory, which is how you know a victory belongs to those who intend to keep it. The Cyclopes returned to their forges and listened to the new notes in the ring of their anvils. Hades walked a path that drew downward until it arrived at a country that would be his to organize and to rule with an attention to fairness that would surprise those who had never thought of him beyond his silence. Poseidon went toward the shores and spoke to waves that had waited a long time to be ruled by someone who could hear their grammar. Hera established courts and councils and taught nobles the hard kindness of being seen as they are. Demeter followed the lines of old furrows and new roads and taught soldiers to lay aside their spears and lift spades, because the ground must be persuaded to forgive. Hestia rekindled hearths in towns that had been emptied by fear and filled them with a warmth that was more persuasive than any proclamation. Gaia did not rejoice. The pain of her long seasons of betrayal had not left her. Chains had been set upon her sons, and her anger found no comfort in the argument that justice had been served. She walked in her unseen ways through ravines and under roots and spoke to the sleeping fires that breathe under mountains. She called to a seed that had not yet sprouted and asked it to grow. Far below Etna, in a chamber where stone sweats and the air glows with its own dull light, something turned in its sleep and opened an eye that had not been given a name by any poet yet. The earth listened to its own heartbeat and decided that there would be one more roar before it accepted the new order. The world had slept for a breath after the gates of Tartarus closed, the kind of sleep that follows a fever and tricks the body into thinking the worst has passed. Fields were sown again where trenches had been, and the forge fires of the Cyclopes burned with the quiet concentration of masters who prefer making to war. On Olympus, the new halls were raised with stone that remembered songs, and the first councils were held beneath rafters where swallows nested without fear. But beneath all this, far below the volcanic bones of Sicily and the long black flanks of Etna, the old anger of Gaia had not cooled. She had watched her sons bound behind bronze and oath, and while justice had been satisfied, mother love had not. She went walking under roots and through shale, her fingers trailing in the mineral rivers that flow without light, and she sought a seed that could still answer pain with power. In a cavern where the air sweats and the rock glows of its own accord, she found a knot of heat with a sleeping face. She bent over it and breathed. The knot opened an eye that was not an eye and learned a single lesson in that first instant: rise. It began with a tremor that made wine jump in bowls and cattle lift their heads and stare at nothing. It climbed from Sicily into the spine of the sea and ran along coasts like a rumor. The sky darkened, though the sun was clear, and then the dark took on a shape. At first, those who watched thought it was a mountain walking. Then they understood that a mountain has only one peak, and this thing had many. Heads in the number of a night sky's bright points rose above the plain, each crowned with a crown of mad snakes that bit at the air and at each other, and laughed in languages that had never been heard above ground. Eyes burned in colors that do not last in paint. Wings beat that were not feather but storm. From the shoulders of the thing flowed coils of living rope thick as city walls, and tipped with tongues that dripped poison and prophecy. Typhon had come. Some say he was the son of Gaia by the fathering of Tartarus. Some say he was the wrath of the earth given person and purpose. All agree that he stood taller than cliffs and wider than rivers, and that when he spoke, the voices of beasts and of men came out of his mouths at once. He strode toward the line of mountains that were still learning to be Olympus, and the air around him went hard and bright, as if sound itself had turned to mirror. The first breath he blew set forests, swaying and lifted the roofs off barns as if they were leaves. The second breath smelled of brimstone and of hot iron. Hunters threw down their spears and crossed themselves without knowing why. Fish died in shallows as the water shuddered. The gods saw him, and for the first time since the war with their fathers, they felt a fear that was not about losing a throne or breaking an oath. This was the old fear that comes when a child hears the house breathe and knows there is something on the stairs. Hera set her spear and told the lines to hold. Demeter pressed her palm to the earth and begged it to be gentle under the feet of those who would stand their ground. Hestia added fuel to flames that wanted to crawl back into ash. Poseidon called storms from blue distances and felt them struggle like colts in a pasture that has not yet learned its fence. Hades looked into the eyes of soldiers and steadied them with a glance that promised both reckoning and respect. Zeus lifted his arm, and the thunderbolt came to hand with the eagerness of a hunting hound that has learned the scent of its master's desire. The first cast struck Typhon square and lit his chest like a torch held inside a body of smoke. He reeled and laughed, and the laughter sounded like rocks sliding in a ravine, and like a love song sung off-key beneath a window, and like a wolf teaching its child to howl. He took a step, and the step mattered more than the wound. Zeus threw again and again, and the bolt stitched the storm creature with lace of fire, and still he came. When he reached the first line of hills, he tore them up like a man tears bread, and he hurled the hills across valleys so that the cartographers of later ages would find strange flat-topped ridges where a clean slope should have been. He beat the air with wings that smelled of wet ash. He shouted, and nearby mountains answered him with red mouths. There are stories that say the gods fled at the first sight and hid in the marshes of the Nile and took the shapes of animals to confuse pursuit. A ram-crowned king, a hawk-eyed archer, a cow-faced queen, a cat-footed huntress, an ibis-headed messenger whose words bent like reeds and thus reached places that straight speech could not. Perhaps they did. There is a wisdom in learning another shape when your own draws the eye of a storm. There are other stories that say they held the first line and learned only then how large a storm can be. The truth sits between these versions the way a river sits between banks. They yielded when yield kept breath in the lungs, and they stood when standing made the hour possible for those behind them. Zeus met Typhon not once but many times. On a plain near the shadow of Ida, where the air smelled of thyme and lightning and sheep, the god came close enough to touch the seething hide and to feel the electric itch that ran along the coils. He drove the thunderbolt in with both hands and forced the monster to drop to one knee. Typhon rose and moved faster than something that size should move and wrapped Zeus in a net of living serpents. Zeus tore free once, twice, and on the third time he did not. The coils tightened. Teeth found skin that had never been pierced. 100 mouths sang victory, and the sky answered them with a silence that felt like mourning. Typhon ripped from Zeus the sinews of arms and legs, the cords of power that let the storm move, and he wrapped them in a bearskin and hid them in a cave guarded by a serpent woman older than cities, a dragon nurse who would later be called Delphine, because there are places where names and guardians are the same thing. Without sinews, even a storm cannot lift a hand. The world shivered. The winds changed their songs. The destructive gusts that would later be called typhoons and whirlers and ravagers poured from the rents Typhon had opened, and for a season sailors on distant coasts learned to fear a certain bruise on the horizon that meant the air had remembered the hour when Zeus lay without strength. The kindly winds, the north and the west and the south that bring weather rather than ruin, hid under the skirts of bigger clouds and waited for a chance to work again without shame. The land itself seemed to hesitate between greening and burning. Men and women in times to come would say that certain fields yield nothing because Typhon once breathed on them while Zeus slept. Gods do not stay broken when others love them. Hermes went first, swift and quiet as thought, finding the right word after a long search. He knew caves the way a poet knows metaphors, and he found the path to Delphine's coil-lined hall in a day that felt like a year. Beside him came Pan, who carries in his pipes the mathematics of fear and the geometry of courage. They found the dragon nurse asleep with her coils arranged like a library, one shelf within another. Hermes distracted her with a dream of riddles that could finally be answered, and Pan set his lips to the reed and played the cracked song that makes even monsters know a small panic. Delphine woke and struck at an enemy who was not there, and in that clean instant Hermes cut the bare skin and pulled the shining cords free. They throbbed in his hands like live eels yearning for the sea. He ran. Pan ran with him, laughing the laugh that has frightened shepherds at noon since the first shepherd learned to leave his flock unattended. Hermes reached Zeus, and with hands that are never clumsy, he set each sinew back where it belonged. The body remembered itself. The storm sat up and sucked in a breath that pulled leaves off trees. The first bolt he called was not a weapon but a signal. The sky answered with a hard blue that made men shield their eyes. Typhon turned his heads and saw not a fallen foe but a hunter he had wounded and not killed. He spat venom and curses, and the taste of both fell heavy upon the ground. He took a step and the world shook, and the gods who had run and those who had stood drew a line together for the first time in that terrible season. They met near the eastern edge of the world, where the earth reaches up into a mountain that men of later ages would call Cassius. The sea there is clear enough to shame a mirror, and the air smells of salt and of the soft rot that feeds marsh birds. Typhon rushed, and the mountain shuddered. Zeus moved with the new economy of a fighter who has lost once and will not waste one motion. He cast the bolt not at heads and not at hands, but at knees and hips, at the hinges of the giant machine. He broke rhythm and then broke it again, forcing Typhon to guess, and then punishing the guess. The ground split and poured forth fire that had been in it since the first hour of the first day. Typhon answered with rock and with tree and with voices that turned men's knees to water. Zeus answered with a net of light. The net tightened. The monster fled north, and the chase cut a wound into the earth that would be remembered by maps. He bled on a long ridge in Thrace, and the soil drank so much that the mountain kept the stain, and men called it Hymus because words remember blood even when skin forgets. He turned west and crossed the sea in strides, and islands trembled as his shadow passed. He came to Sicily and the black flanks of Etna, where fires already dreamed, and there he chose to turn and make his last stand. He pulled up pines and cedar and oak, and made of them a ring of spears around himself, and breathed into them until they burned with a light that pains without warming. Zeus stepped across that ring with the calm of a man walking in a field he knows well, and the flames bent around him like reeds around a stone in a river. He called to the Cyclopes, and they answered with a wind that fed his fire and starved the other. He called to the 100-handed, and Cottus and Gyges and Briareus lifted rocks as careful as nurses lifting infants, and placed them where they would hurt most and not kill friends. They closed upon him. The bolts sang. The trident opened the ground and swallowed feet that were too sure of the next step. The helm of darkness appeared in places where a watchman swore there was only air, and in the next moment a gate was open that should not have been, and through it came a chill that brought men to their senses. Hera spoke, and cowards grew ashamed. Demeter lifted a green shoot from ash, and hearts steadied. Hestia set a small flame at the edge of the field, and those who saw it remembered bread and did not give up. Themis held a staff and declared by Styx that no one would spoil a victory by cruelty, and such oaths have a way of making even victors disciplined. Zeus struck. The bolt went down the throat of a roaring head and came out through the spine in a plume that looked like a banner of light. Typhon sagged and threw up both arms, and for a breath the sky was covered by a roof of writhing serpents. Zeus moved in, close enough to smell the sulfur and the ancient sea that clung to the monster's breath. He set his heel and drove a final spear of light into the ground beneath Typhon's vast chest. The earth opened. The thing fell. The gods pushed with tools and with hands and with will. Rock shifted. The world learned how to make a tomb that is also a mountain. Above them, Etna settled itself upon the fallen rage of the earth like a lid on a pot. The silence after was not clean. The mountain rumbled with the breath of the thing beneath. Fire climbed its throat on certain nights and painted the sky red, while farmers in fields far away turned in their sleep and muttered old prayers. When earthquakes walked across islands barefoot, men said that Typhon moved his shoulders. When a wind tore boats to pieces and flung roofs into orchards, sailors spat and used a name that remembers the monster. Down under the new quiet, Gaia put her palm against the rock and felt what she had made in anger cooling and hardening into lesson. She loved her children, and she hated the chains upon them. She loved the earth, and she would not see it broken by the infinite hungers of one season only. She went walking again, not to wake another storm, but to see what new green would come of all this burning. The gods stood upon a ridge and watched Etna breathe. Zeus held the bolt without raising it. His arms ached with the ache that comes only after a battle that has required muscle and thought, and a patience that bends even divinity. Hera looked at him and saw not only a victor, but a husband who would be difficult and loyal and inconstant and necessary. Demeter looked toward a valley where ash would make the soil richer, and she began to plan. Poseidon stared out to the glittering line where sea meets sky and felt a pull he would answer for an age. Hades turned his face toward a dark country that would be his responsibility and his pride. Hestia thought of doorways and of soup and of a chair that will be offered to a stranger without questions. Themis touched the ground with her staff, and the world accepted the new law as if it had been waiting for it all along. In the cool afterward, Hermes walked from shadow to shadow, like a thought testing the corners of a new room, and Pan sat on a rock and played a tune that sounded like goats on a hillside, and like fear melting into laughter, and like the first day after a long bad season. The Cyclopes went back to their anvils and found that the ring of the hammers had changed, as if the metal itself respected them more. The 100-handed sat at the gates of the deep and stacked stones into towers that would only fall if the world was ready to fall with them, and they smiled, small smiles with many mouths, content in a task that felt like purpose and not like a sentence. The night came down slow and kind. The volcano glowed like a banked hearth. The air smelled of ash and pine and of the sea that was never far. On Olympus, a brazier burned, and a council gathered without fear that the door would burst inward under the hand of a storm. The stars above looked like nails driven into a dark roof by a careful workman, and for once they did not tremble.